Welcome to the Marketing Remix, presented by Red Door Interactive. I'm Reed Carr, CEO of Red Door Interactive. Our show is a senior-level marketer's resource for navigating our ever-evolving landscape. In each episode, in about 20 minutes, experts from different marketing disciplines representing different buyer touchpoints tackle one important marketing topic. Then, what do you need to know, and how does it affect the buyer? Welcome to this episode of the Marketing Remix. We're here to talk about CCPA. What do marketers need to know? On January 1st, 2020, Californians will ring in the new year with the California Consumer Privacy Act, or CCPA. The data privacy law is the latest in an alphabet soup of legislation, GDPR anyone, that governs the use of consumer data. But before the requirements go into effect, qualifying businesses need to make their data protection and user privacy policies compliant, or risk paying the high price of negligence. In this episode, we will explore how the shifting landscape of data handling, consumer privacy, and CCPA will affect the modern marketer. We have Dennis Gonzalez, Chief Operating Officer here at Red Door, and Ron Hadler, our Senior Director of Marketing Technology, joining us to talk about this all-important idea. Ron, Dennis, good to have you guys.
Hey, Reed.
Good to be
Thanks for
back.
having us.
Absolutely. Okay, well, we need to level set here and help our listeners understand what exactly is the California Consumer Privacy Act. Again, it's CCPA, and that's probably how we'll start to refer to it because it's otherwise rather lengthy. Ron, talk to us a little bit about this CCPA.
Sure. As we had already talked about the GDPR here on the podcast, it is another piece of legislation passed to protect consumers, protect the data that is just proliferating out there on the web, and making sure that brands, companies use the data in a respectable manner.
Yep. Okay, so you said GDPR. Remind us again for those who maybe, I'm surprised if they missed that episode on us, but here, GDPR is what again?
The General Data Protection Regulation.
That's right. And that's in Europe, right?
Absolutely. If it's for all those Europeans, and it's what kind of like snowballed this regulations, because we're not only here, the CCPA being really aimed from California and starting that, but this will eventually come at the federal level.
Yeah. I mean, that's the thing we're thinking of here, right? It's gone Europe, California, moving on. And so that's a big reason why we're talking about it, because everyone's going to have to deal with this, everyone everywhere, right?
Well, I mean, just this morning was announced that their FCC has leveled a $700 million fine for the Experian data breach, right? So it's not just the fact that it's happening, but it's really expensive to have these things happen.
It's the FCC won't let me be. I think that was Eminem, right? All right, maybe a little old. But okay, so at a high level though, as it relates to then the marketing side of it, what is CCPA going to mean for marketers? Because that's obviously the folks who are listening mostly to our show. What rights will consumers soon have, and how do marketers have to deal with that?
Right. And, it's very similar again to the GDPR. And, there's lots of little things that allow us to kind of have a hold on that as far as being transparent. And that means, having ready access to your privacy policies and your terms of service, what you intend to do with that data, who you share that data with is important. But also asking consent of those consumers visiting your properties, making sure that they are okay with you using that data, especially if you're going to sell. And then, just also being trustworthy and not using that data other ways that you're going to say you're going to do it.
Yeah. So people have to understand when you're going to use my data, what is it going to, what are you going to do with it, where it's going to go? And that's generally what I think marketers long-term have been accumulating all this data because they want to use it for promotional purposes and outreach, but now you have to be a lot more explicit about it, right?
Yeah, and that is what's going on. And you see that anytime you're visiting websites, because there's so many international websites of brands that people are visiting, and they're just putting this in by default now. This is the normal of mode of operation, and it should be. And I think regardless even of just preparing yourself for CCPA, this is what marketers need to do in general, right? Get ahead of the curve. Don't be behind it and, do that mad rush to get all this done. But, have the ability to have, ask consent, but then log consent. Have the ability to understand where your data goes, who you share it with, and CCPA in particular Are you selling that data? Be very, very careful there, because that is really the difference between GDPR and CCPA is they're really concerned about people selling that data.
Right. Yeah. So, for the most part, then if marketers are maintaining control of it and probably at a baseline level, just kind of restricting how much they put out and give it to other partners and people like that, are probably is a first level of defense, is just to keep it to yourself for the most part. But do you feel like, and what I'm concerned about is how it's such a default at this point that maybe brands, and I'm going to turn this over to you, Dennis, to talk a little bit about this idea of brands may be paying this a little bit too much, just lip service, and say, oh, I've kind of checked the box. I put a privacy policy out, but I mean, done. I mean, that's the concern and the risk that I think that a lot of brands have at the moment. What do you think, Dennis? What do you think brands are going to need to do to not just pay lip service to it, but to make sure they're actually complying?
Well, marketers definitely have to be much more engaged with CMOs specifically at the C-suite level, working with CIOs and CFOs, because they do need to understand how they're going to manage that data from a security perspective, because there are requirements for CCPA, not just managing the data, but if they do get a request to then, say, delete that data that a consumer request or a consumer request that they want to be deleted, they have to be able to then do that. So working with their CIOs or their technical departments to do that.
Right.
Another instance is working with their CFOs. Obviously, this is going to take an investment. There's possibly some liabilities that will need to be understood. So working with the CMOs need to be in tune with that. And obviously, because of the third party concerns that you mentioned, Ron, working with their counsel, working to modify and develop the appropriate agreements so that when they do work with the third parties, that they have the right agreements in place.
So, one of the other parts of it you mentioned was obviously the financial component of this, making the investment, understanding the risk. But on the balance of all this stuff is not just the financial risk of all this, but what does this mean to a consumer if there is in fact a breach, or they can't, as Dennis was saying, the company can't delete the records that a consumer asked for. I mean, is the way I would see it is there's just the reputational risk, and that's even far bigger in a lot of ways, don't you think?
Absolutely, yeah. Because here again, we just saw, as I said, that gigantic fine the FCC levied, that is just hurting their business like crazy, and they're having to provide coverage for all those people because they collected very important information. If you're collecting, just PII, personal identifiable information such as name, address, phone number, that's a lot less risk than collecting social security numbers or credit card payments and things like that.
They do see that differently then?
Yeah, that is going to level, when it comes to like a breach or not complying with CCPA, they're still going to get levied. But if the FCC gets involved, what gets exposed, they're going to market, and your fines will be much different.
So from a marketer standpoint, then going back to that, is this also going to start setting a stage where they maybe don't want certain information to say, you know what, I don't even want to deal with that, or even maybe with their IT department saying, look, this is information we just don't even want to collect?
The feedback we've got from GDPR is that, when it first came out, everybody was like, no, don't follow me. No, don't collect information on me. And now what the consumers are learning is that if I don't give up some of this information, I'm not going to get the features and the benefits that this brand offers me. So there's a value exchange there, right? I, as a consumer, am willing to give up some privacy, allow somebody to use my data to get better marketing, get better recommendations, personalization, which is a lot of what's going on, right? And personalizing ads, emails, and websites based on the information you're sharing with a brand.
Yeah. So from that standpoint, this adds another role or thing that a marketer, I guess, has to do, is explain what a consumer might be giving up if they don't provide this information. And maybe this is getting to, while it adds more to their job, to say not just market to a consumer, but market to a consumer why they might want to give us information and what that quid pro quo is. I know that's obviously just, again, more to do, but I think it's more of it creates the relationship a bit more with the consumer.
Yeah, well, you brought up the term quid pro quo, right? It's one thing for another. Amazon's actually taken it even further than that, and they're offering you $10 to give up your information. So you can go ahead and they're just gathering information like crazy for $10, which as a customer acquisition cost is pretty cheap.
Yeah, I would imagine. Or is it a retention thing too, right? I mean, if you're giving them that information, and you're getting these great benefits from them having that information, and then you don't get that same experience elsewhere, you maybe decide to work more with Amazon or whatever brands choose to do that, because you're like, wow, this experience is so much more seamless over here, and maybe not as a consumer recognize that it's because you gave them all your information.
I think that's absolutely where it's at. You're going to end up as a brand, providing more value than necessarily getting that information. The end point is, you're going to get your sale, your consumption of services, but you're going to have to give a little bit more. And I think experience is definitely one of those things where you can differentiate between brands as to what they are getting for giving up.
Yeah. So it gets beyond then. Well, you have to get active about this and recognize that it isn't necessarily about compliance, but it's actually about enabling and empowering and some of the things you can do from a marketer to a consumer or to ultimately their customer, somebody who they actually have a relationship with. So how can marketers maybe prepare for the arrival of CCPA right on the heels of GDPR so organizations can move past just compliance? I know Deloitte has described GDPR and CCPA as strategic imperatives for the modern CMO. But again, what do we need to do to enable this and get past compliance? Dennis, what do you think about that?
Getting past compliance. I think right now, because we have several months before it's actually implemented, CMOs are in a good spot where they can be proactive about this. I think putting themselves in the shoes or listening to their customers and or the audiences, they can be proactive. Start to think about how they want to get the right processes in place, have the right, communication, so that they can be proactive and make their customers feel safe and develop a sense of trust that when it does come, or it's here. And they need to be able to stand that their data is going to be safe.
Yeah. And given that this is a podcast, can I give context here? Is we're in July right now, July 2019. So there is a little bit of a window here, but it's going to creep up pretty darn fast, and particularly have other things to do and other priorities going on as well.
We've got a little bit of a caveat there, not to want to make people sit back and have more time, but essentially, even though the law is going into effect on January 1st, 2020, brands will have until the July of 2020 to actually get their websites compliant. So they do have a kind of additional 6 months to make that happen before the Attorney General can come down on you and start levying fines.
Yeah. Do you feel like we have a good sense of what real compliance is at this point? And the reason I say that is because I know that a lot of times people go, well, there's all these rules and laws or whatever, but no one's completely clear on this stuff. Since GDPR already happened, do we feel like we have a better sense because of that moving into CCPA?
So there are a lot of differences between
gray areas,
the CCPA and GDPR, right? And GDPR was onerous in the amount of rules that it had. CCPA is a lot clearer cut about what needs to be done. There are some gray stuff that is going on, but for the most part, it's pretty simple as to how to kind of get there for compliance. And I think there's even the point that the law could change prior to 2020. Also, is definitely always up for grabs.
Right. One of the things I heard is that CCPA includes the concept of households and the data you collect for households. What does that mean right now? And they're still trying to amend what the details are for that. So, things could change, but 6 months will come up pretty quick here.
So do you feel like the root of this, it just as described as around the consumer privacy and the empowering the consumers, putting this data or these relationships with brands in their control, compared to what I kind of felt GDPR came from the other end of things and was a little bit more onerous as it relates to, nothing, nowhere, anytime, any place. Whereas in this case, I think they say, look, consumer, as long as you know what's happening, you may want to have this relationship with a brand, like pay Amazon $10 and get the features you want. I feel like it maybe was a little bit more marketing friendly to a degree.
I'd agree with that. The GDPR was just so consumer focused and not sharing data that it really, was like you keep using that word onerous, right? Just really, really hard to do. And did I meet those regulations? Did I not? With the CCPA, I think they take to the point where if I'm establishing a relationship with a brand and I'm sharing my information, I'm showing that trust. I have it because I'm sharing it. I think where they're really kind of making that point is if that brand takes that data and then sells it to third parties or many third parties, how do you trust those people that you have
Right.
no relationship with?
And people have been experiencing that for a while. I mean, you give information, all of a sudden you're getting 15 different phone calls from 15 different brands about certain things, which has created whole industries in a lot of ways, the lead sales and stuff like that. So I think, when people start to feel things now to get ahead of this is, where does this go, right? GDPR, CCPA, and everything else that we're going to see well into this future. When you start to get that feeling, that's a really bad experience, that there's probably some legislation coming to change all of that. And that's what was really happening. So when marketers are doing bad things, and bad things in the sense it's good for the marketer, bad for the consumer, you have to expect that someone's going to have to jump in and solve for this. And I feel like that's when this came in, was CCPA is getting out ahead of it a bit. Since GDPR already came out in Europe, California is handling it the way they're going to handle it, and putting a little bit more power and control in the consumer's hands, as long as everyone understands what's supposed to be happening, so that we feel better about these relationships. Better between the brand, better between the consumer, because in the end of the day, you want these great features that enable and empower, and you have to give up a certain amount of information for that to get that. Some people may not want that, and that's fine too, but as long as we all know. Fair?
Fair.
Agreed.
Yeah. Well, good. Dennis, anything else you want to add from a marketer consumer standpoint that we need to be thinking about? I think what we're all seeing right now is obviously the privacy little banner slipping up there, but there's so much, coming up from the bottom or wherever it may be on a website. There's so much more that's going on behind it. How do you think this unfolds in the next, what we're talking about now, 9 to 15 months or so?
Yeah, possibly. I mean, things that could come up. I mean, Ron mentioned the user experience, right? And depending on how you collect data, what data you collect, could definitely influence, the interactions, the products, service offerings that marketers then need to be aware of and manage now, so that they can get in front of it. I mean, you also want to understand, what can marketers do to get in front of this stuff? If marketers are in control of, well, not total control, but they do understand customer services, products, offerings, and if data and what data they collect is going to affect those, now's the time to start thinking about that.
Yep. So it's relationships within the company, relationships with the consumer, relationships, marketers between their CFO and the investment, IT with the people who can make this stuff happen.
Correct.
With, legal, make sure this is worded right, and making sure it's not about just compliance, but really enabling and empowering is kind of, I think, the summary of all of this.
It's an opportunity.
It is.
Right? This is the new foundation for modern marketing, that, permission-based and, trust with my data protection.
Yep. And therefore there needs to be a reason why you take that information. And so you're making somebody's experience better as a result. So cool. Well, thanks for joining us, guys. Dennis, Ron, really appreciate you guys coming on the show, and looking forward to the next time when we have more legislation to talk about. No one looks forward to that one, but we do look forward to helping our marketers figure this stuff out. So thanks a lot, guys.
Thanks, Reed.
Thank you.
And be sure to check out show notes from this episode at reddoor.biz, and be on the lookout for more CCPA content from the Red Door team. As always, subscribe to the Marketing Remix and leave us a review on Apple Podcasts. See you next time.